I'm Lee Valentine. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Space Studies Institute at Princeton. We've been working for the last 30 years trying to develop technologies to make possible the settlement and industrialization of circumsolar space. I'd like to present to you Dr. Klause Heiss. Klaus was ahead of me by some time. He managed to convince the government to build a space shuttle. Unfortunately, they did not build the space shuttle that Klaus wanted them to build. Had they done so, the Space Studies Institute would be superfluous by now. So he is here to talk a bit about that decision and where we should go now. Thank you.
Lee, I would like to thank you very, very, very much. Indeed, I believe if historians go back, many, many things go back to Princeton on this and the space program. I came over in '64 from some alpine villages in the Tyrol, and then we met. Was very poor, $100 in my pocket, like everybody else who came over. And so I was on Tulane Street in Princeton, and we always had lunch and dinner with an elder lady on the same street. And in there were people from Forrestal, plasma physics. I was a game theorist worrying about the Petersburg paradox, which I'm going to come to. Then we had chemists, we had humanists, people who think about why we do what we do. And around that table, I must say, many things came out. I was working first on the Klause program, peaceful uses of nuclear explosives. Whatever you showed me, I was blowing up. And around that table, there was a scaling law, and that came out actually having to do with Klause. And I said, how come in physics everything works precisely, like scaling 1/3? Others, 1 to the square, other things 1 to the 4th. I mean, some magic here because, in econometrics, other things, it's 2.1, maybe it's 2.5, maybe it's 3, you don't really know. Out of it, then the one from Forrestal came, actually 2 colleagues, and one of them was designing these magnets, and was O'Neill, also poor. And I think that out of that came many, many things in Princeton. I mean, they're all informal. They're not planned, which is sort of what I want to say. And then when you are asked to do something like, how do you do an assessment of the space shuttle system for the White House? Well, very, very difficult, Basically, you have to do it on your own because there are no textbooks on how to do it. And I think there were many, many other people like that. Then the Space Studies Institute was formed, and L5, and we took really, really off. And actually, long before then, there was a vision in mankind for many, many centuries. And I say, people 400 or 500 years ago had much more imagination and were much risk happier than we are today. And what I'm going to talk today is I think this was the right vision. At least on a small system, and then why was it right and what went wrong, and what can we learn from that as we go forward. And I will end today with the idea of a Jamestown group, because I think we did it right 400 years ago. The French did it wrong, the Spanish did it wrong, the Portuguese did it wrong, the Chinese did it wrong, the Mongolians did it wrong. We did it right. I mean, it's just unquestionable, There was no gold in North America, but today the United States is a success. And that goes back 400 years and longer, somewhere over in Europe. And that's where I will end today, and tomorrow I hope to go into more detail. Here we are. I'm Executive Director of High Frontier. And next page. Oh, okay. First of all, the vision. You are familiar with it, but I want to repeat it because people do forget, particularly also at NASA. The Space Task Force report in 1969 had it about totally right. We were landing. July 20, this report was published. NASA doesn't even have copies of it. I mean, it was great difficulty, getting a copy of that report. And maybe they have some hidden here at JPL, but at NASA headquarters, very difficult to find it. Anyhow, the report actually was very simple. You know, we went to the moon July 20 when the report was published. Now we would go there permanently. If they had stopped there, okay, just that. I mean, it's so logical. We landed. Now in the next decade, we'll find out permanently. And they had fantastic vision. I mean, better than today's space vision. I mean, you have more programs in there. The engineering drawings are fantastic. They're not PowerPoint. They're not multimedia. No colors. Okay, but you get a feeling, hey, 50,000 pounds, you know, you have a feeling, okay, that's a payload, and you know roughly how, ox, hydrogen, okay, you know, you try to find today how they land. Well, first it's methane, then it's ox, hydrogen, then it's solids, you know, I mean, it's floating all over. They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not much. I mean, you go back to the reports of the 50s and 60s, you think engineers drew them, not computers, not CAD/CAM, not multimedia. This is how to do cislunar space. It was clearly there, and many other graphs. But then something happened. You know, Tom Paine was NASA administrator, and he's a, you know, God bless his soul, but he was a romantic like you wouldn't believe. So he said Mars at the end. You know, I mean, the report itself doesn't deal with Mars. It's sort of an afterthought, okay? But anyhow, put Mars in, and that word Mars, and going to Mars in the 1970s, by 1981, killed the program. I mean, it's, don't want to go into detail. I have, by the way, a written report on this, which will be published where all the details and footnotes are in. Just believe me, that word killed it. We did it again in early 80s, again, Tom Paine. I mean, that report was fantastic, but it was going everywhere. And as a good general, you know, with the right accent, I know you have to say, I'm going to climb this hill or that hill. I cannot climb all the hills. So we need a concrete, robust next step. And then again, the Stafford report, fantastic. I don't need any vision. I don't need workshops in Washington for 2, 3, 4 days. Now, 2 years after the president said we should go back to the moon and then beyond. It's all in the Stafford report, and very little happened since then. And why does it take 2 years after the president says, let's go to the moon, to have such a workshop? Before then, all these pages are empty. So next view graph. The space shuttle decision, number one, as I already said, such textbooks do not exist. I went in and won the contract, which was completed. First, NASA said it couldn't be done. Then the White House gave them 5 names. Mine happened to be on there. And then the rules were, competition, you limit your proposal to 5 pages, and it's a $3 million contract in $1970, and you will then be subject to a 1-day cross-examination and every one of the others too, so it was a whole 1 week of butcher boards or whatever they call murder boards, okay? So I assembled my team. I said, well, number one has to see, you know, well, let me, the logic. And I went in the presentation, and actually in the pages too. And we went on Tuesday, and I said, look, you cannot justify the shuttle based on transportation costs. If any one of the others comes here, don't believe them. No way. You cannot do it that way. Transportation costs, forget it, you know, it's not there. However, the effect is, what are the effects the shuttle and the space tug, that was also included, will have on how I conduct space operations. And space transportation is only 1/3 of space costs. The other third is satellites, payloads, and the other third, which most Europeans forget about, is the data processing and the uses of the data, getting it into the market or the agency to make use of the information. Now, with a reusable space transportation system, you change all of that, as long as you standardize the satellites for repair and updating at the subsystem level. And that was so revolutionary. So we found, okay, who is the best? Lockheed Missile in Space. They produced most of the military satellites at the time. And so we tasked them to standardize satellites at the subsystem level, do it for small, medium, large satellites. And then we gave all of that to Aerospace Corporation, which was another subcontractor, and they actually adorned the annual report of 1971 with my picture. I was very good looking, newly married, unrecognizable as of today. I'm impressed. And since it was here, maybe I should have done a career in Hollywood. I mean, I'd probably be happy. Anyhow, and then we put all of that together and put it over literally hundreds of different space programs, military, civilian, big, large. And I went over, you know, to the astronomy department in Princeton and said, hey, astronomy, all right, let's go over. And there was a professor sitting, Spitzer, and if I go to a hairdresser, hair cutter, he will say, and the haircut, you go to Spitzer, well, you need an astronomical observatory. And that is how Hubble was created. And Hubble is the only payload in the civilian area which actually was built for the shuttle, make use of the shuttle, the repair, refurbishment, updating, continuity. It demonstrated every single principle that we expounded in our report. And we should have had half a dozen to a dozen other programs like that, and we had them. And we should have had the space tug to also do it for satellites in higher orbits. That's basically the logic. Now, putting all of that together, what people forget is NASA did not propose what the shuttle turned out to be. NASA proposed a two-stage fully reusable system, basically a 707 sitting on top of a 747, with internal hydrogen tanks. It would have cost a zillion. I mean, everybody from Florida to California would have been fully employed. Now the OMB, you know, God bless their soul, they were basically proposing the CEV on a stick. You know, like, have you heard about that? But that didn't make sense because you don't do what we just said. You know, you have to be able to refurbish subsystem standardization, and you have to have an ability of reusability up there. Anyhow, it's a big debate today. We'll come back to it later. And then I said, well, there must be some other versions in between the fully reusable, which we knew wouldn't work, and the big stick, you know, up there, down, tie, to keep aerospace engineers happy, but it was very little used at the time. And we literally came up with hundreds of configurations, hundreds. And I was staying away from Rockwell because I was absolutely convinced North American Rockwell would win. And I didn't want to be caught that I had dinner or lunch with a Rockwell guy that I didn't pay for. But we did go to Lockheed, to Grumman, to McDonald. And I must say, on a handshake, each one of these companies gave us access to all their internal corporate data. You know, today, an impossible task, just on a handshake, by promising, hey, I will not mix the data, and then they did engineering work, and lo and behold, if you go to the next view graph, this was a compromise in October of 1971, which actually Dale Myers, Fletcher, George Lowe basically had decided to doing, and I found it out. So I decided, well, why did I work for a year and a half? I write a memo to Fletcher telling him, hey guys, we are going to come out with something like this. You can forget this, and this is what ought to be done. And this was actually the one that was chosen, the shuttle with the solids, and the other one was the shuttle with pressure feds. And I should have simply lied to my professor and says, look, we went all over this and the pressure feds are the solution. If you can go back to the previous graph, look here. These are the solids, is this, okay? And they clearly have 2 to 3 times higher cost per launch, only $1970, and uncertainties, of course, which we also know here, very large uncertainties, depending how many you fly, but also technical uncertainties. Now the pressure feds were down here, same fuel as in the tank, cross-feed, intact aboard, okay, cannot go wrong, same fuel. I mean, if you have a car and you have to put in gasoline and then you have to put in solids and then you have a battery in the back, it becomes expensive, okay? And particularly aboard, so it was clearly. However, this big difference in operations, okay, there was a difference of 500 million in development costs in the 70s. And in no way would that justify not doing the pressure feds. But I told Morgenstern, hey, this is the difference, and I really think we should go with that. As an introduction, why I was convinced so much of pressure feds, in June of '71 in Princeton, we organized a 2-day get-together of all the top experts in propulsion on the solids and on the pressure feds thing. And I think it was one of the most dramatic meetings ever. I mean, it was all closed. Professor Perkins, Fred Slayton, Jerry Gray, and then the experts from the companies. But literally in the second day, they were screaming at each other, they were at each other's throats. They said, hey, it's irresponsible to go with solids. The worst hasn't happened, on solids yet. But very nice as long as they work, but there are some unpredictables in solids that you do not want to experience. And if you do, it's sayonara. And on the other hand, the pressure feds, I came out of that meeting and said, okay, it should be pressure feds. The long and the short of it, next view graph.
What's R up there?
What? I'm sorry.
On that previous.
Yes, previous.
R.
Oh, these are the different mission models. And these are, in order to justify it, we had the non-recurring costs and the recurring costs. These are transportation costs, but these are the total cost of all the different space programs we analyzed compared to the cost. And these are the savings, operational, the additions. And the higher the interest rate, the lower this is, and the higher the activity rate, the higher this is. And all this is available for you. Actually, I put it on the thing because it's really fascinating how all of this interacts.
That's interest rate? Is that what you said?
Among others. This is interest rate, but then we also did activity levels and we did payload effects, different assumptions. The thing that is obvious from here, whatever you do, okay, the solution was down here. A hybrid, a mixture between fully reusable and partially reusable. And the other one, to have the engines go from ground zero rather than only up there. And the SSME is truly the major thing that came out of the Shuttle program. So, next, and next. And this shows, there are no loudspeakers here, so it won't do any good. Oh, I am sorry, $50. Anyhow, what this shows, and this is this was actually one of the hardest thing to be subject to the last 30 years. Very high officials in NASA who subsequently came, and others, they said, oh, you assumed a mission model of 625 flights. Isn't that ridiculous? Isn't that, well, no, that was given to us by NASA. That's not what we did, okay? And that is, we actually scaled it down, and the level here is about 20 to 24 flights a year, both East Coast and West Coast. That is what was needed in order to justify the shuttle. And very interesting, by the way, this was without what we later called SDI, and this is with SDI. Of course, everybody was running around, blah, 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 let's not talk about it. But anyhow, Max Hunter was part of my team, and he liked lasers, and the article on laser defense we wrote in 1968. And I'm a mountain peasant. I believe in stones, kinetic. So if you throw it down, it will work. And that was the killer bees, which later came out, and today are called Brilliant Pebbles. And Hank Cooper is chairman of High Frontier, and actually advanced the Brilliant Pebbles in the early 1990s. And maybe in another 30 years we'll actually do it. But in any case, you can see the huge payback, and the break-even clearly are 24 launches or lower, not because of transportation costs, but because of the effects on the system. Next view graph. Now, payload effects, I explained it. Next view graph. And as I said, So it was fantastic, okay? And we won. Huge showdown in the Senate. Senator Proxima at the end of many, many hearings said, okay, you have done what should be done. I support it, in front of Senator Mondale, who was leading the troops to actually kill the shuttle. And now what went wrong after the shuttle decision and the Tuck decision? Very briefly, again, I've written it up in a long paper. On the solids versus pressure feds, wrong decision. Utah, Thiokol, Senator Moss from Utah, Fletcher from Utah. Anyhow, solids written all over, okay? Now, I only found out 3 years ago, between Princeton and Somerville in a mafia-type restaurant, going out with that with David and other friends, who was the science advisor under Nixon at the time. He told us, well, Klaus, I understand now. I mean, Fletcher came to me, science advisor, and says, please do an expertise, direct me on the issue of pressure feds versus solids, okay? It's bothering me, okay? I need something. And David said, well, you are NASA administrator, you know, you make the decision. And Fletcher again said, well, I need a piece of paper, you know. Call together the National Research Council, whatever you do, 1 month, 2 months effort, I need a piece of paper. And they said, look, I mean, I'm not going to do that. You make the decision. Well, what Fletcher really meant is, give me a directive to do pressure feds. That's what he wanted to do. That's what would have happened. But the science advisor did not understand why he begged him to do that. And this is history. I mean, the world today would be different if we had taken pressure feds at that time. Let me assure you. I mean, I don't know exactly what it would be, but I think we might be much, much further advanced than we actually are. The next one was, okay, I should have lied. I told you that already. Thermal tiles versus metallic. You know, these thermal tiles, Grumman invented them, demonstrated them, fantastic, everything. But we had other options. We still have options, other options today. Actually, we have more options today. But anyhow, we chose one, and tires have become a problem. They're very nice, but who knows how long the shuttle will fly. We now have so much information that I'm not sure we will fly it very often. You know, too much information can also hurt. You know, rather than, no, I'm very, very serious. We need to go back to 400 years. Other one was European space. TUG was the upper part. NASA didn't have the money. You know, the budget line. This is it. I have to accommodate everything under the budget line. That happened in the 70s, and it was fatal because inflation occurred on top of the fixed budget line, and NASA had agreed to the absolute line. So we went over, convinced the Europeans either to do the TUG. I had a presentation in Brussels to the Council of Ministers, and the Belgian minister asked, well, how do I know this is good? And I said, look, I tell you one thing, if you approve today, NASA will be back to you within 6 months telling you this is too important. NASA was back within 3 months and canceled the European space TUG. Again, if they had not done it, what would be the world? We wouldn't have Ariane Space. Maybe it was a good decision that they turned it down. But it would be different. International cooperation would be different. We would again be much more advanced. But it happened. Cutback on shuttle launch sites, cutback on orbiters. I have on tape 3 tapes. A visit by me and Johann Benson, at that time, Secretary of AIAA, in 1978, February, to Cutler in the OMB, where we said, okay, let's go over these issues. Mandel was vice president. He made sure every second guy throughout the administration was on his side, and Mandel thought, yeah, okay, I don't like the shuttle. So in we went, and that discussion lasted about 2 hours, and we said, look, you need 2 launch sites because it doesn't make sense. If you don't, you have to keep the Titans open. That's $2 billion a year fixed cost just to have the capability. For that, you can build at least 2 orbiters a year if you want to. So build them and lose them, better than building, you know, Titans and shuttles. Didn't make sense. I mean, if that had been what we looked at in the early 70s, we would never have done it. Then, oh, should it be 5 orbiters or 3 orbiters? And they thought, well, it should be 3 orbiters, only 1 launch site. And I said, look, our analysis showed you should have at least 9 orbiters and then build 1 or 2 a year later on and improve them over time because you're losing orbiters. It's irresponsible not to. And he said, well, President Carter in '78 spent 50% of his time when discussing the federal budget on the issue whether we should have WTR, ETR, and whether we should have 5 orbiters or 3 orbiters. Therefore, Carter was a failure. I mean, I don't spend 50% of my time on an issue that actually, if I think a little bit, is obvious. You know, you have many orbiters, you're going to lose them. I'm not going to shut down the transportation production line for a new space transportation system for the next 50 years by building only 3 units or 4 or 5. It doesn't make sense. You don't do that. Yet that is what they did. So I was so irate out of it, I said, okay, I will raise the money needed to build the 5th orbiter. With private money, here are the ground rules, no subsidization, you guarantee us 6 launches a year, and we get all the non-US government traffic. And we give the orbiter to you for integration in the fleet, we are not running it, and that's, oh, and you launch it at incremental cost. The additive cost for one more flight, which turned out to be 28 million. And by the way, you will notice that's what the Air Force paid for decades, NASA, for shuttle flights. And that was due to us, so there was one benefit. Anyhow, so then we started that, but let's dwell here. The budgetary implications were disastrous, I dwelled on it, and since NASA only had money to build the shuttle, they made 0 investment in the missions, the uses, the new uses, other than Space Hubble telescope. That is the real lesson today that we have to draw from the 70s, because that is happening right now in a way that if you know history, in a way that if you know why we are doing it, is truly irresponsible. I cannot see anybody going there and say, hey, reinvent Apollo for twice the money, in twice the time, okay, and not do missions that I will do when I am on the moon. I mean, this does not make sense. I mean, it does not make sense. Next view graph. Private funding of orbit, I mentioned it. I got involved, first I tried it with aerospace industry. I got 2 nice salmon fishing trips out of Boeing in Puget Sound. Boeing was willing to come in, T. Wilson. You know, they just are out of Skylab, they were out of Saturn. Boeing had nothing to do much in space, so they were really interested. And all the other aerospace cohorts, Martin Marietta, UTC, Rockwell, blah, blah, blah. So we went out, great idea. Boeing wanted to proceed. And then strange things happened. I got overnight, midnight calls and say, Klaus, what does Boeing know about solids? Another call, oh, Klaus, what do they know about the orbiter? Oh, what do they know about this? I mean, why is Boeing in this? You know, this should be our business. And I said, well, do you have $1 billion? You know, just tell me. Do you know something about operating airplanes? No. I mean, why fight Boeing? Anyhow, it came to basically closing. And then on February 29, 1980, some of us from High Frontier had a luncheon up in New Hampshire with somebody called Ronald Reagan. We told them about missile defense and also that you need to have private sector involved in this space. And then at lunch we said, well, if I'm president, I'll do it. Well, we did. Actually, what I didn't know is missile defense for Reagan was much, much older than any of us ever were convinced of. It goes back to the late 50s, early 60s. There's a new book out by Lettoff on Reagan and the abolition of nuclear arms, just came out, Princeton. You should read it, it's fantastic. The other side then reinvigorated me, and then I did the purely private funding, financial funding with Prudential and Federal Express, and they were on the board. We had it funded, closed the orbiter, but then the insurance companies said, please find us an expendable backup, because in case the shuttle doesn't work and crashes, like you say, Klaus, we need to launch the satellites, because Prudential at that time financed 60, 70% of all the communication satellites. And that is a lot of money. That doesn't do you any good if it's down here. So we signed worldwide exclusive right to all Titan commercial launches on October 29, 1981, at the first launch of Titan 34D down in Florida. In the end, NASA turned it down, and Fred Smith and I were leaving the office of that NASA official who for 2 hours said how much he was for it, but, how much he was for it, but, and he mentioned Congress about 50 times and other senators 60 times. And now the National Security Council was for it, the president was for it, who else counts? Anyhow, the DOD was enthusiastically for the commercialization as proposed here. Who was against it was NASA and the Department of Commerce. NASA because, again, why am I here in the government? I need power. I don't get a salary. Might as well have power. And the department, no, I'm serious. The Department of Commerce because they just invented this new expendable thing, office. So obviously they had to make sure every expendable satellite, launched vehicle, was being subsidized. So turning that down, I was foolish enough to do two more things. One, commercializing remote sensing. I don't want to take up your time. You can go back. The Title IV of the 1984 Space Commercialization Act prohibits private ownership of original satellite data. That was passed because they had no other angle on us. They used the shuttle like an aircraft, and I don't want to bore you. This now has been undone, but we now are using them. But we were so efficient at that time, DMA, the predecessor of NEMA, the predecessor of the geospatial whatever agency, would have saved up to probably $1 billion with incremental topographic multispectral mapping. I mean, and that was under President Reagan. I, with Craig Fuller, originated the Space Commercialization Task Force under President Reagan. And yet, there it happens because an agency, or agencies plural, the Space Interagency Group, didn't like it. Then I did the Space Columbus 500 Sail Cup, and I just told Friedman, hey, we should give actually the Russians a prize. It was a worldwide competition, US 12 proposals, Europe many proposals, Russia 4 proposals, Japan, China, India, many proposals. The only ones to fly were the Russians in February of 1993. And the rules were private funding, no government funding. So they went all the way down to Armenia, farmers, and they went to Gazprom, gas producer. And the guy who was carrying our briefcases at the time, his name is Nikolai Sebastianov, but he's now head of Energia. But Vladimir Siromatnikov brought the team together, and the first solar sail to fly was on February 4, 5, and 6, 1993, and that was better than what the Wright brothers did, 1903 down in Kitty Hawk, and I think we should honor them for that. There's a new novel out by Arthur Clarke and Stephen Baxter called Sunstorm, and they mention that very prominently in the technical appendix of inspiring them to write this novel, which you should all read. It has to do with the moon, the moon, the moon, the moon, which is why not. Next view graph. Going forward from here, it's actually very simple. Hank Cooper and I did a report for Cheney and then NASA after the Columbia disaster. And clearly we did not invent anything new, but we put it, I think, nicely, and you can download it from our site. It's very simple. Do a goal that you can do within 10 years, which is of historical significance and which answers the question, can humans be in space or not? The Safe Passage report of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences in 2001 concluded we cannot do long duration human spaceflight beyond the moon, period. Those are the facts today. And NASA should acknowledge these are the facts. To find out whether we can do it, we have to go to the moon, probably for decades, with humans, to get the data so that we can, with reason, not totally safe, but with reason, send people beyond the moon so it's not a suicide mission. And I mean, it just couldn't happen. That was known then, so that's what we proposed. At that time, I still come back to my space stuff because somehow it irritates me. They call it many, many different names. By the way, after turning down the space stuff, we spent over $5 billion not doing a space stuff, calling it the TOS, interim upper stage, Center and the Shuttle, many other programs, except none flew, except that TOS gave origin to Orbital Science Corporation. So at least one good thing happened from that effort. we need a reusable upper stage, call it what you want, and do on the moon. Several of you participated very vigorously. 2 or 3 years, condominium idea on the moon, going back to the Space Task Force report of '69. What it is, you have one property manager, fine, but what you do in your apartment is your stuff. It's nobody's business. I mean, we have to assure that whether they are, potato growers or, Texans, or whether they come from Mongolia or wherever, they have to have autonomy over what they do in their apartment under a common property manager. And the observations, there are actually many, many ideas that have came out, except that many astronomers here don't see the full moon on a clear night today. I mean, you say, what's that? And they say, well, Orion. Or, they don't see the full moon, and that battle has to be won. Okay, it's to me unexplainable why, and we now have, by the way, a few missions that do it, and we have to go back to the moon by 2015 and a permanent base by 2020. And if you read the White House statement released on January 14, 2004, you will see that's precisely what President Bush said. You go to the NASA website, I challenge you to find the number 2015 and man. You cannot find it. But that's NASA's interpretation of what the president said, not what the president said. And that, I think, shouldn't be done. Next view graph. Then we did a surround play. People who know bridge know what a surround play is. You sneak in underneath and then suddenly capture your opponent. So we said, well, NASA hasn't said moon base, so we are going to have NASA say moon base. Okay. So we organized 2 conferences, one a year ago, looking from Earth to the moon in Venice. It was one of the most spectacular conferences you can still see, where we had dinner in Palazzo Pisani with Murano chandeliers and Tiepolos hanging from the walls, and it was a great culinary and visual and cultural experience, but more important, the ideas that came out were just unbelievable. We did not invite the Italian Space Agency. We did invite the Institute of Astrophysics, we did invite the National Science Foundation, we did invite the European head of ESA. Jean-Jacques came, took time out, stayed for 2 days. The Russians came, Americans came. It was a fantastic, and the full moon was shining. Please check it. I mean, we timed it right. And then we did another conference this fall on Columbus Day 11/12 in Washington. Some of you were there. And again, I think some spectacular papers. The most important ones is by the Institute of Health, one of the top medical people in the United States said, humans have to go to the moon so we medical people find out about the human body. This has nothing to do whether we ever go to Mars or the moon or L1 or L5. We have to go to the moon to find out how the human body works. Chronobiology was mentioned. Then the immune system, the interactions. 2 things escape me. I mean, there are these polysyllable Greek names. But they said I need at least 12 rats. Over the long run for regressions, I need 24. You have seen these mice experiments. You need 24 to get statistically significant results. So the trick is to get astronauts up on the moon, maybe circulating over 10, 20 years, so we have 24 data, and find out how the human body reacts to different situations. Today, we do not know. We do not know. Not my words, the words of the Medical Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. And we have to remind NASA, don't design your launch systems today because in 2032 you think you are going to Mars, you're not going to go. Because I don't think we can resolve the medical issues in 10 years or 20 years. Maybe never, but it's worth to find out. That's what we owe us, who spent 30, 40, 50 years in this, but more important, we owe it to our grandchildren. Next view graph. Very quickly, this is solar power satellites, solar cells on the moon. Alex Ignatieff is somewhere hiding here. He may give you more. if I can do one football field of these on the moon, the regular, this is if I can have to do it with Apollo systems. I mean, the mass, if I supply the moon from Earth, instead of using the resources of the moon, is astronomical. You're not going to do it. That's also why you will not do a solar power satellite from Earth, and we concluded that in 79, 80, National Research Council, Tom Paine was on it, others were on it, and the minority report says, hey, do it, but do it from the moon. And there's just many other reports. I mean, these are not my inventions, it's obvious. Next view graph. St. Petersburg paradox. This is basically the basic flaw in the ESAS report, just done. The ESAS report says one big launch, with gonads is better than 3 or 6. And I say wrong. And it has to do with St. Petersburg, Bernoulli, 1748, when he saw this guy flipping coins, and nobody was willing to pay $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to play that with him. The game being heads, 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 heads. You get the sum, geometric increase, but when tails shows up, that's it. That's the amount you get. It's to show how risk-averse people are, tremendously. The explanation of the paradox, I had a little bit to do, but next view graph, much better people, a whole series. Okay, I made a mistake, 1738. My God, how could I forget? It wasn't 48, 38. And this is fundamental. What it says is, if I have a massive mission, certainly to Mars, but let's forget Mars, it's not happening anytime soon. But on the moon, if I can do it like Apollo in one mission, fine. But if I have the option of doing it in 3 separate missions, it's better. And if I could do it with 6 separate missions, doing the same thing, same capsules and so on, it might still be better if I plan for it, meaning I will lose a vehicle, okay? But if I have 6 launches doing the same, instead of only 1, I don't risk everything on a single toss. And that is what you should avoid. And it may even be more expensive than 6, but people are happy to pay more to be sure I'm not risking everything. And on top of it, I'm not just going to do 1 mission a year. I will do 2, 3, 4 missions a year like that, meaning in the case of 6, I have 24 launches, so I have the standby for replacements, including astronauts. Very brutal to say, but you do lose astronauts. I mean, the most impressive evening I was to was the 100-year test pilot celebration here in Los Angeles, and I was sitting on the table with the pilot, who had flown the second plane that broke 3 times the speed of sound, and we were looking at a video how 4 weeks before that flight, flying essentially the same plane, blew up with his friend on it. Okay? Now, what would it take today to have any agency operate that way? And the pilot who flew didn't know what he was doing. He knew he was taking a risk. I'm not saying we should take that much risk, but please, a risk-free world does not exist. So we shouldn't spend money on trying to make things risk-free, which intrinsically are not risk-free. Next view graph. So we should do what we did 400 years ago, where King James gave a charter, actually in 1606, so it's exactly 100 years ago, I think it was May, June, and said, well, if you want, go over, finance it privately. The Company of Virginia was formed, and then they set out, and this is the captain, John Smith. This is the coat of arms of the Company of Virginia, and this is what they built. They didn't build a city, they didn't build, a metropolis. They built a very simple fort, which now they have undug, in Jamestown, and which you can see next year. It's a very modest fort. I call it a moon base, but that is how you say out. That's how you begin. And next view graph, that is probably what it should look like. I'm not here to predict, and it shouldn't be only us. And it will be a series of igloos. Eskimos are predestined to be on the moon because they eat fish and algae, which is the menu du jour. on the moon because you have to eat everything. You don't want waste. And they are radiation resistant. You know, and they are small. They are radiation resistant because they got a lot of radiation, and so the people who couldn't stand it died out a long time ago. And they're relatively small, so what better than to have an 8A Virginia company on the moon, which allows you also to find funding. I mean, you're familiar with 8A. If not, visit Washington, you know, it's surrounded by 8A companies. And then you have trolleys from Italy, you know, and then actually the most important thing, these Tyrolean mountain huts. And one, because I come from there, my ancestors, the Iceman comes from there. But most important is, these people used to live isolated from anything on 6,000 feet altitude for 4 to 5 months in heavy winters. And you know what made them do that? These are not blue-blooded American boys going to football games. I mean, you need something else. You need an inner stability. And that is what the Safe Passage report concluded. The biggest problem on long-duration spaceflight is psychological. And NASA better recognize it, otherwise they wouldn't outlaw sex on Mars missions, as I think the recent regulation did. There's nothing more boring to go to Mars with 6 people, and you cannot engage in one of the activities that some of us still engage in. Is that the last one? Anyhow, tomorrow I'll tell you more about the Jamestown approach to go back to work. Any questions? No? Yes.
Guys, actually, when you talk about risk, there's a difference between risk and danger, right?
Well,
No,
one
so for-
sky dangerous.
Right, so for example, let's say riding a motorcycle is risky, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a possibility of something catastrophic happening. Whereas doing like what Evel Knievel did is dangerous because you're doing something that is with the motorcycle that it wasn't really designed for.
Okay. Yeah, maybe. I'm not so sophisticated linguistically to notice the difference. Yes?
The plane on the pressure fed, was that to have the same, on the pressure fed
Yes.
boosters, was that to have the same
Yes.
engines on the
Yes,
boosters
yes,
as the...
yes, yes. And beautiful thing happening, you know, it's the probabilities of success. In fact, that is what I like about Elon Musk's F9. I mean, that, and I mean, I just don't understand, you know, why we haven't hit on it. And that's what I like about Soyuz. And you will notice they are all scaled up V2s. Until we invent something better, you know, might as well stick with V2s. And I attached, by the way, to the article, the memorandum Werner von Braun wrote to the Army generals in Bremen when he came with his troops to the U.S. Army. It's about 8-9 pages long. And Werner von Braun gave me that when he and Frank Borman and I were the first to testify to the Senate. And I think it's worth reading. I mean, basically, he laid out the whole space program and everything later to follow, the technology and the A-12, which was an aerospace plane, and then he said we go on, and with that we can go to the moon, and then later also to Mars. And that's so self-evident, I don't have to explain to you Army guys, you know, why we were doing it. Well, it was obvious in 45, and and it's, by the way, obvious also to other countries. It's just that we forget. Yes?
When you were planning the shuttle, did you ever consider a sled launch as an alternative?
No, what we did consider very, very strongly, and I was actually convinced it would have been the right thing, is Max Hunter came up with the Delta Wing stage and a half, 16 engines. But it was so far outside NASA thinking that sometimes, you know, you cannot propose what's there. Now, obviously, you know, the sleds, other things, have many, many things. Now, many of the electromagnetic propulsion things will work on the moon beautifully. And one reason to go there is it will change all of cislunar and translunar space transportation. It will be sort of the burial of Hohmann in the graveyard of scientifically interesting exercises in mathematics, but not of practical function relevance. Yes, President.
Klause, can you speculate on the role of private capital and especially of risk capital in this potential future development of the moon?
But having been through so many things, it is very important for risk capital and others to come in to have a defined, agreed upon goal, not the how I do it, but a goal. And I really think all NASA needs to do is say, get me back to the moon 2015 and permanently 2020, and I, NASA, will transport you out for $1 and take all the risk. And the moon will fill up with ideas, applications, science, and. Now that is what I call, you know, an economic exploration program, including science. But I think we are very far, removed from it.
You made several references to report and specifically along the web. You get a site?
Yeah, High Frontier, www.high-frontier, and also www.jamestownonthemoon.org and moonbase-usa.org. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm neglecting the right.
I don't know how closely you're following NASA's current plans, but do you see anything on their current CEV and CLV decisions that are as problematic as the pressure-fed force-fed stuff?
I think the CEV itself is excellent because it's the Apollo capsule. So there must be something right about it, and I think that part will proceed, and will be. Although I find it difficult, it's good because we went with that to the moon anyhow. I'm not sure it's actually the right thing to go to Mars, but then that's what we not have to worry about because we won't go there for a long, 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 long time. But it's the right thing for the moon because that is what we came up with in the 60s, so it cannot be all wrong. Now, how I get that up? I think we need a serious discussion in the next 2, 3, 4 months. Not longer. And that is, because I think one should invest in the applications, not in the means. And I do think we have the means to get that up without the risks, substantial risks, of course we are on. And I'm not sure the way we are on, with the solids and so on, we will ever reach the moon before 2020. If that's the case, then NASA has to go back to the president and tell him we cannot do the job that you told us to do, was get us back between 2015 and 2020. But let me say, Mike Griffin is a very strong administrator. He has a lot, invested in it. He's happy to make decisions. Some of these decisions are very deep. They go into the bones, not the meat of the NASA structure. And before he can make the decisions, he has to be presented with alternatives that work and are serious and not contingent upon future systems yet to be developed. So the question is, can we accomplish these missions with the CEV as now designed by 2015 and a permanent base of 12 astronauts on the moon by 2020? Why 12? Well, many of you may or may not know Rutherford Brown headed up the top secret team in the late 50s called Horizon. And that's when he ended up, permanent lunar base with 12 people. Why do I need all these workshops? Let's do what they concluded in 1959. Yes? Yes?
I don't seem to recall, what was in it for King James?
King James, they were about to lose the Portugal. He was nominally King of Portugal. And that was an absolute disaster because they grew port there and wine. And it doesn't grow in England since the end of the Middle Ages. And the cooling, hopefully we'll get back, to those temperatures sometime soon. Anyhow, so one of the key missions which people forget was to grow wine in the Virginias, in the broad sense. That's what they brought. They actually planted. The first thing they planted at Jamestown were vines. And while I'm in California today, may I say, the first wine grew in Virginia, and actually it's not so bad.
So, but then on top of it, he also claimed to be King of Spain and King of France, and of course he was King of England. And it has to do with marriages and, you know, who committed whom and killed whom and whatever. But it was important for legal grounds. He could not have given the charter for North America if he had not been King of Portugal and Spain, because that allowed him, under the division of the world between Spain and Portugal, you know, to take his fair share. It was the Outer Space Treaty of the Middle Ages. Okay. And it had as much relevance to Jamestown as the Outer Space Treaty today has, whether we go or don't go to the moon, but for historical reasons, I